Ward is been a professor of anthro at the University of Texas. He got his bachelor's degree at Cornell and his PhD at Chicago. He first established his reputation as a scholar of the arts in Indonesia, and I'm sure that's, I see some heads nodding, yes. That's how we first knew of his prowess as scholarship. It's really an amazing vita, which I'm not going to take the time to go through. He has written many articles on Indonesia. He's translated a book from Indonesian, annotated and translated, and 3 other books on Indonesia, including perhaps his best-known book of all, which is Javanese Shadow Plays, Javanese Selves, which he wrote published in 1987. For that book, Javanese Shadow Plays, Javanese Selves, he won the Benda Prize, which is the best book in Southeast Asian studies that had been published in the previous 2 years. Now, that same year, 1987, he spent a year in Burma on a Fulbright grant, and that turned his research scholarship not entirely away from Indonesia, but with a new focus. And again, he was studying the performing arts. And 87 was a time when foreign scholars were hardly ever allowed into Burma, and Ward he originally said he was going to go for performing arts, but they wouldn't give him a visa to come for performing arts. So he said he was going to study Buddhism, and that they would allow him to get a visa. That was the only thing you could say you were going to do in Burma to get a visa in 87. So this turned his direction in a new toward a new subject. And since the turn of the century, he's been back to Burma 10 times. He's produced 2 double CD sets of Burmese classical music, wonderful recordings, beautifully annotated by Ward, and, of course, again, exceedingly rare. He's written 3 book manuscripts, all at the moment in different stages of publication. One is a book for teaching of Burmese. One is a memoir, and one is relating to his 15-month sojourn at various times in Burmese monasteries. So he has spent a year and 3 months in Burmese monasteries altogether, which is pretty amazing. And that's the subject of his talk today, which, well, partially. Masculinity, Autonomy, and Attachment in Buddhist Burma. Welcome, Ward.
Is this on? Yes, I believe so. Okay. Thank you, Judith. What I want to do today is to give you the Cliff Notes version of the book manuscript that I'm just finishing up, which is indeed entitled Masculinity, Autonomy, and Attachment in Buddhist Burma. As a result, I will make a number of very broad assertions without a whole lot of support, but I hope that you'll take my word for it. Well, not exactly, but I do. I will be skipping over some of the ethnographic material in order to present the various chunks of my argument. Of course, I'm happy to talk about any elements of this for those of you who can stay after I finish 4 questions.
Excuse me, Ward.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to announce that this is being recorded.
Oh, okay, right. So let me begin by saying that it strikes me as something of a puzzle that masculinity can be idealized in 2 radically different ways, or what appear to be radically different ways in Burma. There's one way which will look altogether familiar to anybody familiar with Southeast Asia, or for that matter, with men pretty much the world over, which is that masculinity should include such things as sexual athleticism. The more sex, the more masculine, the more potent a man appears. Probably a lot of, can hold his liquor and is capable of violence. All of the standard traits that people immediately think of when they think of a real man. Nevertheless, and all that applies in Burma, and there's a lot of behavior and a lot of commentary that very much in line with that approach to masculinity. And yet at the same time, the truly idealized masculine role for Burmans, that is to say, the ethnic Burmans, who make up about 2/3 of the population of Burma. In line with Buddhist thinking, the most idealized masculine role, the most idealized version of masculinity is to be a monk. And of course, that means a number of things. There are 227 rules determining the behavior of monks according to the Buddhist Vinaya. The most important rule is no sex. How is it possible? And there should also be no drinking and no violence, so on and so forth. But so all of the basic traits that many people in the world would think of as fallback definition of masculinity don't apply. And how is it possible that this nevertheless could constitute the ideal version of masculinity among Burmans? Now, other subsidiary questions then come to mind. Oh, of course, another point is that a real man should be financially independent, and a monk must not deal with money. Of course, there are ways to bend that rule and so on, but the fact is that at least ostensibly, a monk does not deal with productive activity in any form. Now, there are a couple of further questions that follow from what I've just said. Not only the question of why is sex so important to so many people's understandings of masculinity, but also why are so many religious traditions down on sex and really discourage anyone who, with religious aspirations, from being much preoccupied with sex. Or maybe the better way to phrase the question is to say, why is it that for so many religions, giving up sex is a particularly powerful demonstration of religious conviction? That's true, obviously, not just in Buddhism, but in a lot in Christian asceticism, so on and so forth. Just as an aside, Foucault became quite interested in this question himself as he developing after his original contribution, the great many people have read on the history of sexuality. And then he started looking to both Greek and Roman attitudes towards sexuality, and came upon a great deal of evidence that sex should be at least engaged in only very moderately by men, and perhaps even with the growth of the ascetic tradition, an ever greater sense that perhaps it was really not a good idea. In any case, let me put that initial question about the relations between masculinity and sexuality, or its or the forswearing of sexuality, put that aside for a moment to talk about monks and their place in Burman society. An interesting question is, how tough is it to live as a monk? And there are two ways to respond to that question. One is to say, yeah, it's really tough. And if you talk to monks about it, what they're liable to say is, what's really hard is not eating after noon. This really gives monks a hard time. And as a matter of fact, it is an open secret, at least among monks and novices, that a great deal of eating does take place afternoon. I learned in the monastery I lived in longest, 7 months in Mandalay in 2012, never to barge into anyone's quarters or between around 6 and 7, because there would be this terrible clattering of dishes and silverware to hide the evidence. But it's one of those things, as if I ask monks about this, they'd always say, yeah, breaking that rule is an infraction, but a minor infraction. Just about everything that I asked about was, yes, an infraction, but a minor infraction, except sex. That's a major infraction, so absolutely has to be avoided. One monk in particular, a man in his 50s at the monastery, was a wonderful informant. I spent many happy evenings listening to him, talking with him about the monastery and Buddhism and so on and so forth. And he said that there were different challenges at different points in a monk's life. He said that from the age of about 15 to 25, sex was really a problem. But you get beyond that. And then between around the ages of 25 and 40, monks have to deal with their material urges. So sex is still kind of a problem, but it's the desire for material goods that might preoccupy a monk, and he has to learn to get around. He said, and then once you're about 50 or so, all of that goes away, and all you're concerned with is your health. He was a man in his 50s. That's all he said. That's all he was concerned about. Overall, however, if you want to describe, as Burmese describe, the difficulties of being a monk, they simply exaggerate the challenge that confronts all Buddhists, which is finding ways to break their attachments. Attachments are what cause us suffering. This is Buddhism 101, yes? That only if we can overcome our investments in this world, only if we can overcome our attachments, can we attain the kind of equanimity that will enable us to live our lives in some sort of peace and at the same time maximize our store of merit and prepare ourselves for a good rebirth in the next life. The ideal image of the person who has truly best been able to overcome attachment, to overcome desire, is the forest monk meditating alone. This, of course, is much more talked about than realized. There aren't a lot of monks meditating alone in the forests of Burma. Nevertheless, as the ideal, as the figure that stands at the apogee, it's a very powerful representation. If you are familiar with a book called Forest Recollections by Kamala Tianave, it's a wonderfully vivid description, highly idealizing, romanticizing, of the Thai version of this same ideal. While that ideal stands there, and it is the prestige of meditation has become so great in Burma today that most monks will lay claim to doing some meditation. Claims that I'm not in a position to either verify in any way. I don't know to what extent monks do actually meditate every day. But they have to say that they meditate because it has come to seem to be the primary obligation of a monk, the way in which a monk best justifies his existence and his standing as a monk. This is, I think, relatively new. Textual study was always the real focus of a monk's activity. And for most monks in Burma to this day, it is actually what they spend most of their time doing by way of religious practice. Interestingly, though, meditation is now deemed the most important, the most prestigious activity that they can engage in. Now, the intensity with which texts are studied in some monasteries, by no means all, but some monasteries, is absolutely mind-boggling. I don't know if many of you may be familiar with this already, but I was very impressed, particularly in the third monastery that I stayed at. The first monastery I stayed in Mandalay was a kind of garden variety monastery where there were a certain number of novices and monks. They were permitted, they could, if they wished, go off to classes. It was near the great pagoda, the Mahamuni in Mandalay, where there are a lot of monasteries. And as I say, monks and novices at this monastery could, if they wanted to, go off to classes being held in various places so they could learn the Pali texts. They were not obliged to. The abbot of the monastery just said it was up to them. As long as they didn't break any rules, they could live there and do what they chose. But the monastery I stayed in for 7 months in Mandalay in 2012 was well regarded, well known in Mandalay as a center of learning. There were about 140 monks and novices, more novices than monks. And almost all of them engaged daily in the memorization of Pali texts. Novices would start around the age of maybe 8 or 9, and the goal was to pass a set of exams, the Dhammasariya exams, that are administered nationally by the Department of Buddhist Affairs. There are also private organizations that administer similar exams that are considered more difficult and therefore more prestigious. But most people take the national exams. To prepare for those exams, what you do is memorize texts. Shortly after I moved into the monastery, I was talking to a monk, a man in his 20s, I'd say, a very nice guy, and I was asking him about the kinds of studies that boys undertook, novices, when they first came to the monastery. This was in the month of November. The academic year starts in June. So I said to the monk, at this point, say novices that just started this past June, what have they learned? What have they been doing for these months? And he said, well, they would have started with the first little collection of texts that every novice starts with. But he said, but I'm not sure how far they will have gotten at this point. So there was a novice walking by, and he said, hey, novice. So this novice came over, and he said, what are you doing in your class these days? And he said, we've finished the book. So what are you doing now? So now that our teacher is telling us what it means. So they had spent 5 months memorizing these texts in Pali, a language they don't know, not knowing what they were saying. Now that they'd gotten through the text, they could go back and their instructor would tell them what the texts meant. This is standard procedure. There's no notion that you are memorizing these texts in order, first and foremost, to understand them. You are memorizing these texts to acquire them and to be ready when you are tested to repeat them. Now, eventually, if you spend years at this, you will acquire a vocabulary in Pali. Mind you, Pali is from an unrelated language family, right? So it's not like going from English to German. It's like going from English to Arabic or something like that, right? You will, there are readily available texts, palm leaf manuscripts, and also at this point, of course, printed books that will have Pali texts and little interlineal translations, they look like clouds in comics that will give you the Burmese translation of the words. However, the monk that was so friendly and generous to me, who was very famous because he had, as a young monk, memorized 1/6 of the Pali Canon, he was contemptuous of most monks, saying that they never actually learned to understand what they had memorized. He said they could learn a lot of vocabulary, but they didn't learn the grammar well enough to understand what the words, they understood the words, but they couldn't put them together and make sense of them. But that, of course, is not really the focus. The focus is acquiring, internalizing the texts, rather than understanding, interpreting, let alone, of course, critiquing the texts. I think it's a very different understanding of what you're doing in textual study. As I say, the immediate goal is to pass a series of exams, and passing those exams places you, gives you a particular standing among the monks. So it's a way of pursuing a social standing. It's a way of marking your status within an organization. The preoccupation with establishing your relative status is absolutely pervasive in Burman society, as it is in every society that I'm familiar with in Southeast Asia, Java and Bali, the two other societies that I know best. It is not surprising that a similar preoccupation should be pervasive among monks. There is an impression among outsiders that although secular society in Southeast Asia is deeply hierarchical and concerned with relative standing, that this falls away in the Sangha, in the community of monks. But of course that isn't really true. It's just that the criteria by which standing is determined changes. The basic rule is it is the number of Lenten seasons that one has worn the robe continuously that determines your relative standing. And when all of the monks and novices line up in the evening before entering the main hall for evening recitations, the order of the number of Lenten seasons determines the order in which monks line up. Not novices, but for monks that certainly applies. Nevertheless, there are other mitigating factors. How many exams you have passed also affects your standing within the community of monks. And if you can maximize your titles, that will bring you greater standing. And certain perks. There were, for example, in the building facing where my quarters were, there were 2 stories. And there was a monk, mostly it was monks and novices who lived in the big halls in this building. But at the end of each floor was private quarters occupied by one of the senior monks. The senior monk downstairs had actually been a monk longer than the senior monk upstairs, but he had fewer titles. Therefore, his prestige was lower. Therefore, he had the lower floor, not the upper floor. Higher is always more prestigious than lower in Burma, just as east is more prestigious than west and north is more prestigious than south. Prestige ranking pervades all elements of space and everything else. And so there is no unmarked, there's never any unmarked category. And that includes among, as I say, among monks. There is clearly a status ordering. And the quantity, the proportion of the Pali Canon that you have memorized does indeed matter importantly to your standing. I would say there's something more about what you're doing as you acquire a command of the Pali Canon, which is that you are actually drawing into yourself some store of potency which inheres within the Pali Canon. And I'd say that this is a concern, the desire to maximize the strength, the power that inheres within you is an ongoing and really pervasive concern among Burmans, especially males. And so this is very much a part of what is going on in developing impressions of your own masculinity. It is finding a way of maximizing within yourself some version of power or potency. It can take a number of different forms. Let me put that aside for a moment and talk more about attachments. What monks must do is overcome their attachments. They should not be deeply invested in personal relationships. I think this means, among other things, that there is an option for Burmese males who would prefer to keep their personal relationships at a certain modest degree or moderate degree. There is an option for them. They can enter the Sangha. And it seemed to me characteristic of many of the monks that I observed that this did indeed, that their relations, both among themselves and with lay people, and lay supporters are very important, obviously. Nevertheless, that the nature of that relationship was always kept modest. A story that really I found quite telling in this regard. There was a monk about 40 or so years old, quite a handsome man who was at the monastery, and a good friend of this monk who was very kind to me. This monk of about 40, it turns out, had actually been a very enthusiastic soccer player as a boy and did not want to become a novice or a monk. He really wanted to keep playing soccer, but his parents really urged him to become a novice, which he did eventually. He was staying at a very famous monastery in Amarapura, south of Mandalay, and going out on alms rounds every morning. And a woman noticed him. And one morning she said to him, did he have a sponsor for his ordination? Because it was clearly he was getting close to the age when he would be ordained. He said, well, his parents, of course, would be his sponsors. And she said, no, I would like to be your sponsor. And he said, well, my parents wouldn't permit that. She went and spoke to the abbot at the monastery where he was staying, and the abbot thought it would be a good idea, prevailed upon the man's parents to let this woman sponsor his ordination. The sponsor gets a great deal of merit for having done this. She then persuaded him. She was a spinster, visiting her sister in Amarapura, but she lived in Mandalay. She persuaded him to move to Mandalay, to the monastery where we were living at this point, because I was close to where she lived. So he moved there, and for the first several years that I was living there, she came by constantly. She'd come once or twice a week. She'd bring him gifts of food. She'd bring him this and that. However, he said, after about 10 years, he said to her, you don't need to come by so often. Now, this is a very polite Burmese way of saying, don't come by so often. And I said, and how did she respond? And he said, she just laughed, which is a very polite Burmese way of expressing embarrassment or unhappiness or whatever else. And I said, and does she come by? And he said, oh, well, she comes by from time to time, maybe once a month, but maybe months go by without coming by. Now, I found this story quite touching, especially because she had told him way back when she sponsored his ordination that she had never married, therefore never had any children, but if she had a son, she was sure that he would look like this man. So she had felt some sort of bond with this young man, and he had eventually chosen to not break the bond, but certainly to minimize it. And it seemed to me this was quite characteristic, and furthermore, minimizing bonds in this way is praised among, certainly for those Burmese men who enter the monastery and commit themselves to the religious life. Why should this appeal? Why should this win praise? Why should the Buddhist message that we should limit our investments in other people, why should that resonate so powerfully in Burma, and in fact in other parts of mainland Southeast Asia? I would trace this, let me say before I go any further, I'm not trying to pathologize this. I think that this is a particular choice that people make in their, in how they choose to live their lives. A choice that, in fact, we all have to confront. To what extent do we wish to invest ourselves in attachments to other people? To what extent do we wish to protect ourselves by not attaching ourselves to other people? To what extent do we want to feel bonded to others? And to what extent do we want to feel unbound? To what extent do we want to feel autonomous? I'd say that the Western therapeutic tradition very much inclines toward bonds, attachment. Attachment theory, as you may know, is very important in contemporary psychological or psychotherapeutic circles. I'd say that in Buddhist Burma and Buddhist Southeast Asia, on the contrary, autonomy is very much emphasized and is very much it is prescribed as the reasonable response to this existential conundrum, which is that if we become deeply bonded to others in a world in which everything is flux, we will suffer the loss that when people are lost to us for whatever reason, we will suffer loss and we will suffer. If we can overcome our inclination, our desire to attach, we will protect ourselves precisely from that suffering. So I come back to my question, why should that particular emphasis upon autonomy resonate so much, appeal so much? And I would say that in a place where social standing matters so intensely, as it certainly does in Burma, you exist as a person in this world, first and foremost, as a person with a particular place. Maybe not just one place. In fact, your place is always relative to the people that you are, in any given context, that you are interacting with. Every interaction, however, is marked by your relative position, whether you are a subordinate or a superordinate, and your identity really plays out. It is constructed in the course of interaction, in how you comport yourself, the degree to which you are able to convey the fact that you know your place, and at the same time, at the kinds of behavior that you elicit from others, whether or not they find your presence, your demeanor, your standing such that they should offer you deference, or they can treat you with contempt. There's an intense and constant awareness of this play of relative standing in every interaction, which I believe makes people always aware of, sensitive to the fact that they are vulnerable in interaction. That interaction always brings with it some element of risk. I don't think this is an absolute difference between them and us. I don't think Westerners are oblivious to the implications and, for that matter, the affective consequences, how we feel from what transpires in our face-to-face interaction. I think it's quite a bit easier for me, for example, as a professor at the University of Texas, if some student treats me with disrespect, I dismiss them as uncouth boors and don't think a whole lot more about it. In Southeast Asia, it would be more serious. If a student treats me with disrespect, yes, I might well dismiss the student as phrases in Southeast Asian languages come to mind, kurang ajar, insufficiently trained in the ways of interaction. But still, it would speak badly for me that my presence was not such as to impress upon the student. My standing should impose itself upon any person with whom I interact. I think if your self consists in the way you comport yourself and the behavior that you elicit from others, if that's really the preoccupation of social interaction, then you are very much aware of the degree to which you are at risk in encounter, and you are very much drawn to whatever practices and procedures may release you from that feeling of risk. What kinds of endeavor will permit you to feel not at risk, to feel invulnerable? And I think this connects to a considerable concern, attention, throughout Southeast Asia to invulnerability magic, amulets, which are a huge deal in Thailand, not quite as big a deal in Burma, but similarly, methods by which you build up within yourself powers of resistance to what's outside you. One of the benefits, a major benefit, of amassing polytexts is that this is seen as granting you greater powers of resistance. You become less vulnerable to attacks of whatever sort upon your health, your safety, your well-being, if you have a lot of these words within you. These are powerful, these are potent words. I'm getting short on time, so let me jump and come back to my original question, which had to do with masculinity and sexuality. If you are powerful, and a man wants to be powerful, You demonstrate that power, obviously, in your ability to constrain other people's action. The degree to which you can act autonomously is the degree to which you can resist constraints being imposed upon you, and at the same time that you can constrain the actions and the behavior of others. That bespeaks your power, which is considered appropriate to the masculine role. Masculinity then gets the opposition between masculine and feminine then aligns with the opposition, although it's really a spectrum, between autonomy and attachment. Women are expected to favor attachment. It's one of the ways that women are both valued and disdained, because women are so invested in their attachments. If nothing else, women are so attached to their children. It's just something women can't get beyond, apparently. Well, it's a good thing, because then they take care of the children. Releasing men from the obligation to take care of the children, so that men's autonomy is supported by women's attachment to their children. Oh, and to monks, because of course it's women that support monks. It's not men who support monks, not nearly as much. Men will subordinate themselves to truly impressive concentrations of power, such as a few extremely powerful monks, which do exist in Burma, obviously. To subordinate yourself to a really powerful monk is not demeaning to a man. But most men do not choose to subordinate themselves to average monks, or for that matter, to other men if they can help it. Much more appropriate and fitting to a man's self-regard is to be able to act autonomously and to impose himself upon others. Sexual athleticism, sexuality, of course, metaphorically lends itself to a reading, to an interpretation as the imposition of a man's power upon someone else. Probably a woman, although it doesn't really matter. I won't go into this, but what matters about a man's sexuality is whether he penetrates or is penetrated. The biological sex of the other person doesn't matter. So a real man, that's the phrase, can have a transvestite male partner as long as the real man penetrates. It doesn't in any way impugn his sexuality or his masculinity. So a man imposes himself upon others, demonstrates his mastery over others. So, but what about a monk who does not do so? I'd say that, in fact, it is much the same thinking that explains why a monk's asexuality is so impressive, and in many ways along the same lines. Because a monk who is asexual has mastered not only others, he has mastered himself, and that is considered even more impressive. An even greater display of autonomy. He is without attachments to others. He doesn't even need a woman. He doesn't even need anyone. Ideally, he is absolutely alone in the forest. And again, the ideal is he eats only what he finds naturally in the forest. So he doesn't even need lay women providing him food in this idealized image. At this point, as the sole meditator without attachments in the world, he has gotten beyond all interaction. So he's not imposing himself upon others, which you would normally associate with masculine power. But he has become absolutely invulnerable. He has become totally without investments. He need not interact in any way. And this constitutes, I think, an astonishing but perfectly logical ideal. It would be interesting now to turn away from masculinity and talk about femininity and women. In a sense, it's the obverse of everything I've just said. Women and also trans women, much the same. Trans women and women are the people that seem unable to exercise the kind of mastery that one associates with masculinity. However, I do want to leave a little time for questions, so I'm just going to stop there and ask you if you would like to pursue any particular topic. Thank you.
I'd just like to comment. I think that there's a male persona which involves the accumulation of power, but which doesn't involve renunciation or isolation. That is to say, at least in traditional Burma, the kings, the people who involve themselves in the world most intensely, could also accumulate enormous amounts of good karma, which was represented by Pone. And they would have the same instinctive veneration, if not more, that attached to a monk. And in a sense, they are the worldly counterpart to the monks. The two are mirror images of one another, but they're both masculine.
Yes, and so indeed the king represents that idealized version of masculinity, which is active, which is imposing, which participates in the world. But if he is able to amass enormous amounts of merit and doesn't accumulate so much demerit in his role as king, then in another life, presumably, he'll rise up the ladder still further, right? So he'll either be reborn in heaven or even become a monk. And I think the ideal is always, ideologically at least, that he will be able to progress still higher.
Yeah, I think the goal is always the goal is to become a Buddha.
Right.
And in that sense, to escape the world. But that's an ultimate objective. Intermediate status involves both involvement in the world and the accumulation of enormous autonomy and functional power.
Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. That's it was a great talk. In particular, there are two things through my mind. First, it would be, could you make the leap then to sort of Kajawan and Javanese theories of masculinity, semen retention, all that sort of stuff. But within the sort of monastic world, what did you see about disciplines of the body? Because if you're talking about sexuality, then there's also this sort of physical sensation that goes on. So in Thailand, Cambodia, monk monasteries are actually known as hotbeds of sex. Particularly older, I mean, sort of with a power differential worked into it. Mm-hmm. Things like shaving of bodies by novices and stuff like that is imbued with not being sex, but it's highly sensual, and it includes genital touching and all that sort of stuff. So I'm sort of wondering, although this is a big thing that's not supposed to happen, you also have an entire all-male sort of space in which there is a fair amount of sort of sexual or semi-sexual contact all the time. Mm-hmm. And so how do they, if it's this big thing and people know what's going on, I mean, they actively look the other way around this stuff. So I'm just sort of wondering if you could square that a little bit with what you just said.
Well, you know what the Burman response would be to your second point? Oh, those ties. We know about those ties. Just about Java. Some of you in this room know Amref Widodo, I believe, who was here for a number of years. When I was just finishing up my fieldwork in living monasteries in Mandalay in 2012, I did a little lecture tour through Australia. And I gave an early version of this talk. My thoughts were still rather inchoate, but still I was been thinking about all these things. So I gave a talk, and during the Q&A, Andre said, well, that all sounds like Java. And in fact, I do think that much of this seems very familiar to me from Java. I believe in the region of Southeast Asia as a region. I don't think it's a neo-imperialist creation or imposition. As a matter of fact, the monk that I was just talking about, I was interviewed by a journalist in Mandalay while I was there, and I said that when people talk about anything in Burma, they always say, well, it has to be traced back to Buddhism. So the privileged level of explanation always is Buddhism made Burma this way. And I said to the journalist, but I don't really buy that, because I've spent many years in Indonesia, and much that I find in Burma seems very familiar. So it can't just be Buddhism that explains everything. So the journalist wrote that up. This monk read the interview, and he said, well, you're wrong, of course. Buddhism is the explanation for everything that we do. And I said, well, yeah, but what about Java? And he said, Java was Buddhist. Well, 1,000 years ago, yes. Good enough for him. That explained the affinities as far as he was concerned. About sex. Here's the problem. Sex is the one rule that is absolutely binding. And if anyone is discovered, any novice or monk is discovered having sex, then he is run out of the Sangha and is forbidden ever to take on the robe again. Does that mean nothing ever happens? Of course not. But it does mean that nobody could talk with me about it. I mean, you could not, if it's known that a religious person is having sex, he has to be run out of the Sangha. So at one point, I was in Mandalay, I went to Rangoon, and a friend, an Australian friend who was doing research having to do with transgender in Rangoon said, hey, I read about monks, or I heard about monks in Mandalay beating up prostitutes because those prostitutes had been having sex with other monks. And I said, really? I didn't hear anything about that. So when I went back to Mandalay, I asked this monk that I could speak frankly with about that. And he said, oh, yeah, sure, of course. And I said, well, I didn't hear anything about that. And he said, of course, no, you won't hear about that. That's always kept out of the news. Monks know about it, but it's never released to the public. So sure, sex happens, and I'm sure it's a homoerotic environment, but it cannot be discussed. And all I can say is, no doubt, but I can't. Of course, there are certain ways in which it is made difficult, which is the fact that most monks and novices live in these big halls, these open halls, where there's absolutely no privacy. So it isn't, there can certainly be a lot of homosexual activity without any actual sexuality. Oh, and by the way, a novice is never allowed to bare his body, even when he's all alone. Absolutely never. A monk can bare his body if he is bathing in private. Only then. And most monks, only the senior monks at a monastery have private bathing quarters. Most people bathe outside, like most Burmese bathe outside. Always fully dressed. So.
How do these themes play out with? Okay. How do these themes play out with female ascetics? Is autonomy valued the same way, or are they seen as taking on a masculine persona?
There's a really interesting new book by Kawanami, a Japanese woman who has been a nun in Burma for extended periods. She makes much of the fact, as anybody who talks with Burmese about the fact that there's great ambivalence about women becoming nuns. They're gaining prestige to some degree, but a great many people are very dismissive. Both male and female Burmans are dismissive of women who become nuns, and precisely because it doesn't make any sense. What are women doing becoming nuns? What are women doing withdrawing from relationships? And Hiroko Kawanami has these very moving stories in her book. I've talked with nuns a little, but I don't have a lot of data myself to back this up. I've talked with people about nuns. But she has moving stories, one about girls deciding, yes, absolutely, they want to become nuns, and their parents fighting them tooth and nail. It sounds like a coming out story for a gay boy in the West. This is absolutely unconscionable as far as the parents are concerned. And then, even if they do become nuns, the kin are constantly pulling them back. So if anybody gets sick, well, of course she should come back and care for their ailing kin because they're women. So the idea that women should be autonomous arouses very ambivalent reactions. There is respect. Certainly some people do feel respect for women who manage to become nuns, and it's considered to some people, of course, since it's even harder for women to break attachments than for men, then we should truly respect them. But that's very much a minority opinion. More prevalent is, no, that isn't what women are for. Therefore, it makes no sense. And indeed, the status of women nuns is equivalent to a novice, not to a monk. And women are not given cooked food, they're given rice, uncooked rice, and other uncooked foods. The whole system is very much one that keeps their standing low. There are, of course, exceptions, and as is so often the case in Southeast Asia, there's no rule that can't be bent. So the monk that was very helpful to me took me off one day to meet an extremely powerful nun who is very well connected, and as a result has built an enormous new nunnery on the southern part of Mandalay. For the opening ceremony, she invited 1,000 religious. She gave enormous monetary gifts to all of them, and it was just totally over the top. Because one of the members of the junta was impressed with her charisma. She happened to be taken under the wing of a very famous, powerful monk from earlier in the 20th century. And that's the kind of genealogy that impresses people. So she's doing great. That doesn't mean that nuns as a category enjoy that kind of prestige.
Why, or you said that women support monks and not men so much. In what sense? Are you talking like in a monetary sense? Or like would wealthy women support monks, or would, say, a woman demand that her husband give her some of their wealth so she could support a monastery? Or what does that mean?
I'm talking about all kinds of activity, from the most modest, which is standing in front of the house in the morning and putting a little cooked rice in the begging bowls of the alms bowls of the monks and novices that pass by. Some men do that. Far more women do that than men. Going to the monastery to help out in whatever way. Going to talk to monks about whatever issues might be on somebody's mind. A few older men will become, lay people will become trustees of a monastery. They will take care of financial affairs and so on and so forth. But just the numbers of lay people that involve themselves in the day-to-day activities of a monastery, women are much more likely to do that than men. And if you ask Burmese about them, many of them will quote a line attributed to the Buddha, which is that for every man in heaven there are 500 women. And the meditation movement, the mass lay meditation movement, which is really, very important in Burma today. Ingrid Hjort, whom some of you may know, has written a book about it recently. The proportions, for example, I did a 10-day Goenka retreat in Maemyo. There were 130 of us, 100 women, 30 guys. This is altogether standard. If you ask, as I did, a great many people, a great many men sitting in tea shops, why women are so much more assiduous about meditation than men, the first response you're liable to get is, oh, well, men have to make money and support the family, and we're busy. We can't do things like go off to a meditation retreat for 10 days. Women can just say, oh, well, they'll have their sister come cook. They can go off. Well, I would point out, just looking at whatever tea shop we were sitting in, that there were a lot of men sitting around drinking tea, and women are usually running around making money, cooking food, taking care of the kids, doing all of this stuff. And a lot of men would concede that point. And then they'd probably say about how, yeah, the Buddha said there were, for one man in heaven there were 500 women. I mean, it really doesn't compute, but this is a standard. Everybody knows that women are more religiously inclined than men. It's also true in Catholic Europe, right? I mean, this isn't solely a Southeast Asian phenomenon.
Could you make some comparison between the madrasa in Java and the temples in Burma, just offhand?
I don't have much ethnographic experience in Java around madrasa, but I have to say that the way that the Quran is memorized in Java and the way the Pali Canon is memorized in Burma looks very much the same. I do think that these are ways of ingesting power. They're not ways of engaging intellectually. And I think of Pete Becker, actually, who I think was very sensitive to the different ways that people could relate to language, and that was a really interesting one. The trouble is, of course, that Western, largely Christian understandings of exegesis have become so much the conventionally understood right way to engage with a religious text, that in Southeast Asia today, to say that people choose not to interpret, but rather to acquire, is taken to be a put-down, and therefore is rejected out of hand. But in fact, I think it's still very much the way that this works. And so yeah, that looks very familiar to me.
Very male institutions.
That's right. Although girls in Java and nuns in Burma do indeed memorize texts. And in fact, people have noticed that nuns are doing really well on those national exams. Yes, they can do it too.
Just one point to reinforce what you said. In Burma history classrooms, the standard procedure, I don't know if it's still done, but until fairly recently, was for the professor to come in and read verbatim D.G. Hall's History of Burma, which the students would then write down as best they could verbatim. And then when the examination came, what they were supposed to do was to reproduce, again, verbatim what they had memorized from the textbook.
Absolutely.
There's absolutely no interest in analysis or intellectual engagement.
That's right. Interestingly, with the this monk that I had most conversation with, I kept trying to figure out what these exams were like, the Dhammasariya exams. And he kept telling me, oh, no, don't even bother. You wouldn't understand. Well, one day I found, they do practice exams all the time, and I found a sheet of paper blowing in the wind that had some of these questions. So I brought it to him, and he sort of rolled his eyes, and he said, okay, and he started it. And it was some excerpt from a text, and the student had to be able to identify it and expand upon it and so on. And I said, well, now, does it ever, in any of these exams, is the test taker ever asked to explain a text or comment upon a text or suggest alternate interpretations of a text? And he said, oh, you mean so you take a passage and you comment upon it and you develop a take on it, so on and so forth. I mean, he understood perfectly what I was describing. And he said, no, never. And he didn't say that apologetically. He just said no. He was familiar with it. That's what Westerners did. But that was not what they did. So, it's just, it's a procedure that some people might want to do, but it's not what is undertaken.
Power exists, and what you want to do is internalize the power.
That's right.
Not create alternate sources of power.
I mean, yeah, and questioning, I mean, who are you? And why should anybody be interested in what you think? What matters is that you are tapping into a source of power, which is obvious. I mean, it's a clear concentration of power to which it makes sense from which it makes sense to draw. So, as a matter of fact, I spent 3 months, close to 3 months, living in a monastery which is a Buddhist university, and set up by this very famous Sirigu Sayadaw, who has set up monasteries in America, one outside of Austin, Texas. I was interested to see what they do. Monks and nuns from Mandalay go there every day for classes. And in class, what they do is they read late 19th, early 20th century English translations of the Pali Canon. They read it in English. They then talk about it in Burmese to make sure they've understood the English, and then they go on to the next passage. They don't interpret, they don't comment, they don't analyze, they make sure they've got the meaning. I said to one of the monks once, well, why do this in English? And he said, well, they're advanced enough, they know all the texts in Pali, they don't need to work on the Pali, so they're working on their English. What kind of English are they working on? Late 19th, early 20th century renderings of the Pali Canon. I mean, this is not the English you're going to be using day to day, but it strikes them as the appropriate. I mean, and immense amounts of time go into this. As a matter of fact, the monk that I've referred to repeatedly doesn't know English, but several years ago, a Canadian couple stayed at the monastery for a little while, and he was the only person that could begin to communicate with them with his tiny bits of fragments of English. He thought this was not a good thing, so he set about learning English so that he could answer questions if any foreigners showed up again that didn't speak Burmese. So what he did was he took a book by Usatuma Wen, who was a Harvard-educated Burman man who published a number of books about Buddhism for foreigners. They're published in Rangoon. This monk, who had memorized a sixth of the Pali Canon, memorized pages and pages of this man's books about Buddhism, so that if he met a foreigner who wanted to know about Buddhism, he could tell him. Now, his pronunciation, of course, was such that no one who didn't know Burmese would have a clue what he was saying. But this struck him as a perfectly reasonable way and with the absolute best of intentions, to help people who want to know about Buddhism. Yeah.
If they can't understand the Pali, if they can't understand the Pali text, what do they base their morality on? If the Pali text is the fundamental text of Buddhism.
There are a small number. The question is, if they don't understand the Pali text, how do they derive their basic precepts for how they should live, right? But of course, there's a very small number of very, very frequently repeated remarks, the basic precepts that every Buddhist must observe, that everybody knows. They probably know it. They certainly know it in Burmese, and they probably know the Pali equivalents. Just like my Irish Catholic grandmother didn't know Latin. She knew certain phrases in Latin. That was good enough. She didn't really need more than that. What has become extremely popular and widespread in Burma just recently are called Dhamma talks. They're public sermons that people go to, and a town quarter will have a series once a year, maybe 10 nights in a row. They'll have Dhamma talks with different monks that they invite to give these talks. And people attend them, more women than men, in huge numbers. When the Sirigusiado gives one in Mandalay, whole blocks are closed off. The streets are completely closed off because thousands of people will come to hear him give a Dhamma talk. In the course of a Dhamma talk, a monk will use a device that I've seen all over Southeast Asia, where he says something with a rising intonation, and then the audience is supposed to respond with the final words or the final syllable. He'll say something like, in Buddhism, there are 3 baskets, and he'll name the 3 baskets. And then he'll say, distinguished members of the audience, in Buddhism, there are how many baskets? 3, Venerable Lord. Is this news? Is anybody learning something new from this experience? No. They are enthusiastically participating in a performance in which they get to demonstrate their obeisance, their religious enthusiasm, and also their obeisance to this figure. And this will go, a great deal of an hour-long or 2-hour-long sermon will be stuff that everybody knows perfectly well, which will be basic precepts of morality, basic understandings of Buddhism. It will not be surprising or new. And it doesn't need to be. It will be appropriate. It will be suitable to the occasion, and it will be, and if they're lucky, it will be entertaining, and there'll be jokes, and so on and so forth mixed in. Maybe not. I've been to ones that were very serious from beginning to end. It's just that it depends on the style of the preacher. But so, really, the basic understanding of what you do, everybody has it. Everybody knows. And memorizing Pali text, I think, is something a little bit different. It's a protective mechanism. And people do. Lay people will, many of them, start the day and end the day by reciting Pali texts. But that's a protective mechanism. It's a way of assuring their own well-being.
also look at that board, Keeler?